Darkness had already begun to cloak the countryside as I settled onto the last bus. My phone was dying, so with what little charge I had, I called my friend Mike to let him know how long I'd be. It was his place I was staying at, and we'd arranged to meet at the stop near his house. As the bus trundled along the narrow, winding roads, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My unease intensified when I noticed a peculiar man seated across the aisle, his eyes fixed on me. I tried to distract myself on my phone, but that lasted all of 10 seconds before the battery completely drained. Still, I kept on pretending to swipe, hoping he'd lose interest. However, as the bus rattled on, he persisted, occasionally trying to strike up a conversation. Each time, I offered polite but brief responses, hoping he'd get the hint. But his invasive persistence only heightened my discomfort. Unable to bear it any longer, I decided to disembark a few stops earlier than planned. As a dirt path cuts through an abandoned farm with the stop I needed on the other end. The bus pretty much just circles through the town and around the farm at this point before escaping back to the city, so I wasn't really going to lose any time. The cold wind swept through the deserted farmlands as I started my trek towards Mike's house. I had been here before, but the moonless night made everything unfamiliar. I was pretty sure it was just a straight path, but I wasn't even sure I was on a path anymore. I had no idea whether it was dirt or grass under my feet. As the minutes grew, my confidence waned, and a chilling sense of isolation set in. I felt a presence lingering in the shadows, haunting every step I took. Every rustle of crops, every whisper of the wind seemed like an ominous warning. My heart wouldn't relent. Its pounding echoed through the fields, matching the rapid rhythm of my footsteps. I kept telling myself I'm just being paranoid. Taking a moment to prove it, I stopped dead in my tracks, listening out for someone else's footsteps. But of course, there were none. Relieved, I gave a soft chuckle, and when I felt it was safe, a little laugh slipped out. That relief vanished quick when I heard somebody laugh back. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation, where one minute you're worried about how fast your heart's beating, and in an instant it stops beating and drops down into your stomach. Well, that's where I was, torn between fight and flight. I tried to remain as still as possible, thinking that if I couldn't see anything, then whoever was there couldn't see me. It seemed to work for what felt like an eternity, but then the scratching started. 3 slow strikes and then puff. A flame emerged from his lighter. My heart must have been in my pelvis at this point as I realised who the mysterious figure was. Lighting a cigarette that pointed straight forward out of a sinister smile, it was the man from the bus. It suddenly dawned on me that he was close enough that when the lights went off, he would have known my exact position, and probably did since we left the bus. I started to inch back. He started to inch forward. My fight or flight instinct began to kick in, and I knew there was only one thing I could realistically do. As soon as he took another drag of his cigarette, I hoped that the light from it would obscure his vision. Even just a little was better than nothing. I took the opportunity and I ran. I didn't look back, but I knew he was following me. I couldn't hear his footsteps, but it felt like a Michael Myers moment, where no matter how fast I ran, he was going to catch up to me. In my haste, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated farmhouse that seemed to have been abandoned for years. It was only a small building with a door that was so worn around the edges that it just swung effortlessly on a rusted hinge. I thought briefly about going in and trying to hide until I heard someone approaching fast. There was no time. I couldn't run without being seen, and there was no way I was going to trap myself in there. So again I tried to buy just a second of time. I slammed the door of the building and darted around the corner, hoping he'd be distracted enough to go inside while I made a quick getaway. It didn't work. His footsteps didn't go towards the door. They just got louder and louder as he got closer to my position. Panic set in. There was nowhere to run and now nowhere to hide. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use it as a weapon as I started to build my courage up, tapping the phone hard against my forehead to try and egg myself on. He was close, just around the corner. I had to get the edge over him. I emerged, jumping around the corner with my right arm held back, ready to implant the plastic into his skull. It was Mike. I tell you, as much as my heart kept sinking that night like I'd never felt before, I'd never felt it rise like it did when I saw Mike. My emotion got the better of me. and I burst into tears as I pushed my head into his chest, wrapping my arms around him. He'd waited at the bus stop, but when I didn't get off, he asked the driver if he'd seen me. The driver told him I got off a few stops back, and apparently the weird guy got off right after me. Realization washed over me like a wave. The man had targeted me from the moment I boarded the bus, and he had followed me into the dark farmlands, lurking in the shadows with sinister intentions. We went straight back to Mike's house after that, with both of us looking out to make sure we weren't followed. I didn't sleep that night. I thought about making a police report, but there wasn't really much to report. Still, it gives me the creeps just knowing that guy's out there somewhere, probably waiting in the dark for some other poor, unsuspecting soul to get off the bus. I live in an old mill town in Massachusetts, which is split into two main areas. There's a slightly more affluent area, which is where you'll find the main businesses of the town, and then the residential area, mostly old factories that have been converted into apartments alongside a few houses, which is where I live. There's a main road that connects the two, which I normally take home. It's quite a nice road, snaking through a combination of old wells and modern complexes, and even though I've lived here for a few years now, there's always something new to find. One particularly hot day in July after a grueling shift at work, I didn't care too much about having a nice walk. I just wanted to go home, and hoping to shave a few minutes off the journey, I tried taking a shortcut through Horseshoe Alley, which bends around a couple of abandoned mills that were deemed beyond repair. I've walked past the entrance a few times, but never had the urge to take a different route until today. It was like something was pulling me in. Against my better judgment, I set off. I knew it wasn't going to be the pleasant stroll that I normally take, but I wanted something a little different. Well, I definitely got that. A cruel shriek struck the air. It was either the sound of a distressed animal or the wail of a banshee. The sound pierced my skin like a fierce gust of wind, slowing me down to a complete stop. And when I stopped, so did the screaming. What in the hell was that? I thought. I listened out. Nothing. Shrugging it off, I continued through, but immediately started hearing the noise again, only this time a lot more faint. I stopped again to listen. Nothing. Slowly I stretched out my leg and took a long stride forward. As soon as my foot hit the earth, I heard the briefest scream. I was more curious than scared at this point. I was still pretty sure it was some kind of animal, but was it just a coincidence that it happened to make a sound just as I was walking, or was it in my head? It didn't even occur to me that it could have been someone messing with me because there's no way a human could make that sound. But then again, I couldn't tell you an animal that does either, unless it's one being tortured. I marched on, my curiosity turned to frustration as the sound started up again, completely disorientating all my other senses. I was about halfway at this point, and whatever was making the sound would surely reveal itself as soon as I got around the corner. It got more and more intense as I advanced, and I practically jumped around the bend in a pathetic attempt to catch the entity off guard. There was no one there, just a couple of dumpsters against an old stone wall, which is where it sounded like the strange sound was emanating. The sound intensified as I approached, but both dumpsters were completely open, so I couldn't understand how an animal could be trapped in there. Regardless, I began my inspection. Peering into the first, it was surprisingly empty, clean even. A few empty chip packets and beer cans, but otherwise brand new, which only added to my confusion. Looking around, it was your typical dirty alleyway. It was at this point that the graffiti on the wall grabbed my attention. The whole wall was strewn with all manner of words and markings from over the years, but this particular section was different. It looked fresh, still wet and in bright red. I held my breath for a second when I saw the 3 words that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Beware the beast. By now the screaming had entirely penetrated my ears as my eyes remained fixed on the wall. I reached forward audaciously, leaning over the dumpster, needing to touch the words, if anything just to make sure that it was definitely paint. My fingers trembled and then bang! I was pushed straight into the dumpster with the lid crashing down on top of my head as I desperately tried to escape. Frantically pounding on the top but to no avail, I was trapped. The shrieking grew more menacing, getting louder and louder as I pounded from the inside. Something else pounded from the outside. I fought hard for a moment and then accepted my fate. Whatever was outside, I was at their mercy. Engulfed in a metal casket, I thought I was surely going to die if I wasn't dead already. Life flashing before my eyes, I briefly imagined all the things that I wanted to accomplish, all the things that I didn't do but should have. Then it hit me. I'm not dead yet. I mustered up all my might and did the only thing I could. I called the police. The sweat from my fingers smeared across the screen as I dialed, and when they answered, I practically shouted my location to them. I asked if they could hear the screaming, but just as I did, it stopped. Instead, I heard the muffled sound of people chattering in the distance, and then a laugh. It wasn't a sinister laugh though, just a couple of women casually walking past. With my phone still against my ear, I used my free hand to push up on the lid, and was surprised and relieved to find it opening right away. I shot up to my feet and was met with their confused stare. I mean, what would you think if you saw someone emerging from a dumpster? It's weird to think I felt embarrassed by the whole situation, and perhaps I should have warned the girls, but I knew they'd think I was crazy, and all I wanted to do was go home. I ran around the rest of Horseshoe Alley, and even when I reached the safety of town, I didn't lessen my pace until I reached the house. The police came to my house late that evening to take my statement. I could tell by their faces that they didn't believe me, and when they said, "We'll do all we can," I didn't believe them. At this point, I'm not even sure if I believed it myself. Maybe it was all just in my head. And whilst I have been back to the alley with friends since, I'd never walk through alone. In fact, I can never take a shortcut again without a voice in my head telling me, "Beware the beast." My name's Jack, and I've always been a curious soul, eager to explore every nook and cranny of my small town. But on that fateful night, my curiosity would lead me down a path that I would soon come to regret. It was a chilly autumn evening, the kind where the moon hung low in the sky and a mysterious mist seemed to veil everything it touched. As I was walking home from a late-night study session, I decided to take a shortcut I'd heard about from some local kids. A path that cut through the dense woods that bordered our town. Despite the eerie atmosphere, I pushed any feelings of unease aside, thinking it would shave precious minutes off my walk home. The narrow trail was scarcely used, but I felt confident enough to take it. However, as soon as I stepped foot into those woods, an unsettling feeling washed over me. The rustling of leaves in the breeze seemed to echo like whispers in my ears, and the shadows played tricks on my mind. My footsteps quickened, and I tried to shake off the inexplicable fear that gripped me. But the further I ventured into the woods, the more twisted and tangled the path became. It was like a labyrinth, and I couldn't help but wonder if the kids who told me about this shortcut were playing a prank on me. But I pressed on, determined to prove my bravery to myself. As the minutes turned into what felt like hours, the darkness deepened, and I noticed something odd. The moon, which should have been behind me, seemed to be following my every move, casting its eerie glow directly ahead, illuminating the path like a spectral spotlight. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the mind, but the sensation was undeniable. My heart pounded in my chest as my instinct screamed at me to turn back. Yet some strange force compelled me forward, urging me to see what lay at the end of this twisted shortcut. I clung to the hope that I would soon emerge back into the familiarity of the town and out of the grasp of the haunted forest. At last, the path widened slightly, and I stepped into a small clearing. My relief was short-lived as I realized this clearing was like none other. There was an odd-shaped tree, and the ground was marked with peculiar symbols drawn with some unknown substance. Fear gripped me once more, and I took a step back, intending to retrace my steps, but it was too late. In the darkness surrounding the clearing, I caught glimpses of shadowy figures moving through the trees. My heart sank as I realized I was not alone. Panic surged through my veins, and I tried to summon the courage to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. The figures emerged from the shadows, and my eyes widened in terror. Their faces were obscured by masks, grotesque and unnatural, and they wore tattered cloaks that fluttered like gusts in the chilling wind. They moved closer, their footsteps silent, and I felt like a helpless prey trapped in a predator's snare. "He's come to join us," chuckles one through a raspy voice. "I think he wants to play," says another in a high-pitched voice just as creepy as the first. "Do you want to see our toys, Jack?" I didn't know what terrified me most. A lump manifested in my throat when they said my name, but that was nothing compared to the horror I faced when a third figure began reaching into his robe. "We'll give you a head start," he mocked as the moon bounced off whatever object he had half hiding. I had no intention of sticking around to see their toys or in trying to figure out how they knew me, and instead took up the offer of a head start. Wasting no more time, I shot through the middle of them, bumping shoulders with one and knocking him to the ground. Without looking back, I fled through the sinister obstacle course. Every tree I passed made me flinch, terrified that another figure would emerge. Eventually, I saw a light coming from the town, and knowing that salvation was near, I took a second to catch my breath. In between each pant I took, I heard chanting, "Jack, Jack, Jack." Was I part of some kind of demonic ritual? Or was it just those kids messing with me? Or worse, my friends, since I never actually told them my name? There was no chance in hell that I wanted to find out, so I bolted towards the town, hearing my name fading into an echo. I got home and told my parents what happened. I couldn't tell if they were angry about what happened or just angry that I stupidly went into the woods alone. My mum practically had to beg my dad not to dismount the Winchester above the fireplace, but to be honest, I wish he did. That night, as I lay in bed trying to shake the fear enough to sleep until daylight, I remained alert, listening to every roar of the wind made as it battered the hedges around my house. And I swear to this day, when I closed my eyes, the wind howled my name, Jack, Jack, Jack.